couple of years ago, when I was working with Google.org, a colleague of mine sent me an article called Ecosystems in the Age of Cassandra that was on Science Progress. And it was a fantastic article, and I knew as soon as I read it that I wanted to get in touch with its author, who we have here today. Kristen Marhaver is a Caribbean coral biologist at UC Merced, and she's here to talk about basically what, sort of, I guess, following on to what she wrote about in that article, which is how to make scientific information organization relevant to policy and to the public, so sort of moving beyond the way that things are done today. So it is a distinct pleasure of mine to introduce Kristen to talk with you today.
Thanks very much for being here. I know there's so many distractions. It seems amazing that you guys can avoid the coffee maker and end up over here next to my PowerPoint slides instead. Never mind. And thank you also to Adam, because nobody who organizes a seminar, I think, ever gets enough gracious praise for jumping through all the hoops and doing all the logistics. So I really appreciate your help in hosting me here. So the title of my talk is kind of hysterical on purpose, because one of the take-home conclusions of this talk is that scientists don't really get many chances to tell the public what's going on in the world. And so when we get our chance every few years, we yell hysterically because someone's about to cover our mouth and send us back into the lab the next day. I'm going to move my bag. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Otherwise, it's going to get kicked. So my name's Kristen Marhaver. I'm a coral biologist in the Caribbean, and I currently work at UC Merced, just inland from here, a few hours. And I do my research in the Caribbean on the island of Curacao at Carmabi Foundation Research Station. But I finished my PhD just last year at the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation in San Diego at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And while none of these groups necessarily endorse anything I'm saying here, the people at Scripps were very important in helping these ideas take shape and encouraging me to go out into the world and start yelling about them. So they get credit, I guess, for anything intelligent. You guys have a really cool workplace, and I'm sure you're used to people telling you that, but mine is pretty cool too. This is where I work. Just want you guys to know. I study this coral right here that takes up most of the screen. It's one of the longest lived, and it's one of the most abundant corals in the Caribbean. And I try to figure out how a baby coral decides where to live, given that it has to spend 500 years sitting in that same location. And they start out the size of a poppy seed, so they start out looking like this. And they somehow manage to withstand everything that the ocean has thrown at them and everything humans have done to be the size of a car. So I was actually working in the Caribbean when I wrote this article for Science Progress, and that's how I ended up here today. So it's this idea of the age of Cassandra. Scientists are making warnings that the public's not listening to, and then bad things are happening when we could have prevented them. And when I was somewhere in the tropics, and I got an email from Adam, and maybe some of you guys know that being emailed by Google feels like a hand has come out of the sky and tapped you on the shoulder. And so I asked my friend, like, how did they find me? And he said, well, they're Google, they know everything. And I didn't think that was a good answer. I said, well, what did they Google for where I showed up? And so I went back to the article and I tried to figure out what it was, and I realized that I'd written this sentence, this may be the age of Cassandra, but it's also the age of Google. So I think you guys Google yourselves. And that's how you came up with me. It's very creative. Now I know how it works around here. So the talk I'm going to give is sort of loosely structured on what I wrote about, but it's a little bit more targeted toward you guys as Googlers thinking about organizing information and thinking about helping the world be a better place. So the take-home conclusion is as follows. There's a problem with the way that we're organizing scientific information. I think it's because scientists tricked themselves and everyone else into thinking that things like date and author and citation number were sufficient enough to find our way through the literature. And that didn't used to be such a big problem, but the more scientists learn about things going wrong in the world, the more urgent it becomes that we have better ways to find our way through this information. So you'll see me talk about not only how scientists sort the literature, but also how policymakers get to it, how the public might get to it. There's so many different levels of confusion, and I'm going to try to present a vision where we can get everybody better access to science. I'm certainly not saying that as soon as we organize this better, the world is saved. So there's lots of nuance and complication to figure out too. So this is the agenda for this talk. I'm going to talk about phishing. Then I'm going to talk about how science is not the news. Beer and makeup, because those are interesting to most people. The most boring parts of the internet, I'm here to tell you what they are. And the information age. So starting out with phishing. As you can imagine, being a grad student in conservation biology in the 2000s means that you're exposed to story after story about how the world's oceans are doing. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you about that, but I want to give you one example of the kinds of things that we're worried about, the kinds of things that make us write hysterical titles on our talks. So a classmate of mine at Scripps named Lauren McClenahan did a study in which she went to Florida sport fishing charter boats and found all of their pictures from recent years and all of their pictures back through the 60s and the 50s. And she used those photographs to measure and track how sport fishing catches have changed through time. A 2x4 has not changed size in 50 years, and the average human hasn't changed much. And some of these fishing charters actually still exist in the exact same place that they did 50 years ago. So she did a really quantitative study of not only which fish species we were catching through time, but also how big they were. The amazing and sort of useful thing about her study is that there's pictures that come with it. So this is what you would catch if you went sport fishing in Florida in the last couple of years. And here's what you would catch if you went sport fishing with the Greyhound in 1958. So that's what humans did to the ocean. They're groupers and sharks. They're mostly Goliath groupers, which are now endangered. Actually, people are considering releasing the protection on the Goliath grouper because they recovered 18% from their level in, say, 1994. But if you realize that that's where we started and then we went down to almost nothing and we came up 18%, that's not really the most spectacular of population recovery. So it's currently illegal to take those out of the ocean. So this is the kind of thing that scientists have hanging over their shoulders. Marine biologists are thinking about this all the time and saying, we need to do something about this. It's not an abstract, we love Earth for her resources kind of thing. It's we're running out of fish. We're almost down to the last fish. And this is a story that we not only have to be able to tell each other well and tell policymakers, we have to get this story out to the public. If you would like to see another talk in which these two photographs are followed by more stories about how the ocean is doing, this is a TED Talk that you should spend time watching. This is a talk by Jeremy Jackson, who is actually a professor of mine at Scripps Oceanography, and who is the PhD advisor for Lauren McClenahan, whose photographs I just showed you. And the story is not, the title is not complicated or nuanced. We wrecked the oceans. Now, Professor Jackson is sort of the focus of the anecdote I'm about to tell, because he not only was the professor who charged our class with becoming good science communicators, he also said the sentence that got me to sit down and write for Science Progress and that got me involved in this issue. So he had a class that we all had to take when we showed up in grad school, and in addition to learning biodiversity and environmental economics and governance, we also were trained in science communication. And on one day we had publicists and press agents and journalists come, and they talked about how to get your science into the news. So Professor Jackson had written this paper in 2001. It's called Historical Overfishing and the Recent Collapse of Coastal Ecosystems. And what that paper basically said was that it's not as bad as the difference you saw in those two photographs. It's much worse than that because humans have been degrading the ocean's ecosystems for far longer than we had realized. So since the time of the colonists, we had been eating all of the seals and whales and turtles and sharks, and getting down to the big grouper was already halfway to nothing. So that's a pretty important piece of scientific information. And Professor Jackson and his co-authors sort of launched a media blitz. They said, let's write a press release, let's send photographs and interviews and quotes and video clips, and let's send it out to all these media outlets so that people will talk about this in the media. And so Professor Jackson said this sentence, which rang through my ears and which I still remember to this day. He said, most scientific articles are only in the news for one day. But we got this science article from 2001 in the news for 3 days. Some of you had the reaction I did. So here are those 3 days of news. I went back and tried to reconstruct them. A Science magazine publishes the article on July 27th, 2001, and then various news outlets pick it up and report human plunder of the seas, historical overfishing, started the problems of the oceans. And 2 days later, it was still interesting enough that the New York Times published it. 3-day-old news in the New York Times. And then here's the news coverage on day 4. So here's what's still wrong with the ocean on day 4. And so when Professor Jackson said that, he was describing a real achievement in science communication, getting somebody to listen to science for 3 whole days, but I was in a panic. I'm sitting there in the first year of grad school thinking, how am I ever going to do science fast enough to make a big enough scene about what's going wrong and how we should fix it? And that has bothered me for a long time. And I think only recently I've been able to describe this problem well enough to try to figure out how to solve it. So the question that's been hanging over me all through grad school is, can we ever do science fast enough? And I think that the answer is we can't, if we continue to treat it like it's a series of news articles. So that brings us conveniently to the next part of the talk, which is science is not the news. Now, this is going to be a little bit overly detailed, but I think it's worth considering what the news is and whether science fits in that category or not. So, features of the news. The news produces itself. Like, nobody has to go out and say, I'm going to make some news happen today. It happens, and then we talk about what just happened. And it's created to inform people, but not necessarily to benefit or to be useful. It's just created to tell people what's going on. And it's created rapidly. It doesn't take a long time to create the news because it's just happening. And that means you can fact check it quickly too. It only takes a day to fact check a piece of news. That means you can update it and revise it every day. And that means old news is not that valuable to us as a society. After a couple of days, we have newer news, and the old news is old news. And that means that we sort it mostly based on when it was published, and then where it was published, and who published it. So what I'm going to try to convince you of is that science does not fit in these categories, and it's not the news, it's actually a product. So consider your favorite product. Don't think about science, think about sneakers or pharmaceuticals or software or some sort of invention, some sort of product that people make. Products are produced to serve a need, to fill a purpose, to fill a role of some sort. They don't just come into being on accident on any given day. And they're created to benefit people. They're not just created to inform, typically. They're created to serve a purpose. And they're created with lengthy forms of quality control, with error checking, with stress testing, with drug trials, with durability tests. And that means you can't make a new product every day or revise it every day. But that's okay because old products are still useful, and we let them stick around in society, and we keep making them for as long as we think that those are good products. So that means when we want to go buy something, we want to go find something useful, we don't search for it based on when it came out. We search for it based on whether it does its job, whether it's a good product at doing its job. So think about all of these two categories and think about which column a piece of scientific information should fall into. I think it falls into every category of it has every feature of a product, except the fact that we currently organize it based on when it was made and where and who did it. So this, I think, is the problem we're having with science communication. We're treating science like it's a flood of little news bits, but each piece of science took an immense amount of work to create, and it was made to benefit people for a long time. But journalists and news cycles are bored with what we have to say after just one day. So how do we search for good products? Well, this is the part of the talk where I tell you about beer and makeup. The reason I sat down to finally write for Science Progress is I got really aggravated one week when I bought new tires for my car, and I bought new mascara, and I went to a new restaurant, and all of those were really easy decisions to make, and I could confidently find the best in each category with about 15 seconds of clicking through Consumer Reports or Amazon or Yelp. And that's because everything that we organize in society nowadays is based on user rankings, based on how good stuff is. So if you want to go find the best beer in San Francisco, you ask Yelp, and then they tell you to go drink some Anchor Steam. So that Anchor Steam is, what, 300 years old? Every other beer that's been invented in the meantime, we don't think is as good as Anchor Steam in San Francisco, and that's fine, because Anchor Steam is the best. It's the most useful, we like it the most, and the users of Yelp told us so. So you have a pretty good chance of having a good experience if you go drink a pint of Anchor Steam. This is also really efficient. So this is the wisdom of crowds. It's other people telling you what's good, and it's easy to get through. There's also the idea that good products can stay useful for a long time. So I hope that everybody at Google who's interested in searches or the wisdom of crowd or just what people do in their free time that can benefit others knows about makeupalley.com. This is an absolutely fascinating website. There are thousands of people on Makeup Alley at any given time, and they're rating beauty products, and they're swapping their beauty products in this sort of like underground beauty product marketplace. And there's like people in chat rooms providing on-the-spot beauty disaster remediation advice. It's absolutely fascinating. And so now I don't buy anything unless I go ask the tens of thousands of Makeup Alley people what they think. So you can go to Makeup Alley and find a specific product, or you can go ask what's the best beauty treatment there has ever been. And the most fascinating thing about this is that if you ask Makeup Alley that, you get that some of the best beauty treatments are honey, which is what you see here, along with oatmeal and aspirin and lemon juice and olive oil. Cleopatra took honey in milk baths, and the wisdom of the crowd in the internet age tells us that that was a smart move. Everybody thinks honey is a great beauty product. So the ridiculousness of this is trying to convey the point that if something is good and it does its job and it's useful, we let users rank those things and we keep those things above the rest of the list where everybody else can use them too. So that means that shopping for a product is efficient and easy in this world, even if you know nothing about the product. On the other hand, if you try to go shopping for good science, it's really difficult even if you're a scientist. So this is the part of the talk where I tell you about the most boring parts of the internet. And I'm sorry to Google Scholar that one of them is going to be a Google Scholar page, but I really do love Scholar and how it culls PDFs from I don't know where. It's amazing. But there's one useful point to make there. I'm going to stop waving my tea around quite as much. So compared to the way it's easy to shop for everything else, I'm going to show you a little bit about how scientists try to shop their way through science. The paper that Lauren wrote with those photographs of the fish changing through time lives here now, in other places in the internet, but it lives in Web of Knowledge with a little title and a couple buttons. And there's no marking there that tells you like this is really important and fascinating and useful for people that are trying to save fisheries. So is anyone ever going to find this and then make a good policy decision or write to their congressperson? And then if you find that, can you even get to the article? So almost all science is locked behind a subscription wall of some sort, and you can only get past it if you have this sort of super powerful, rich academic library buying access where you shell out $15 an article. Or you call your friends who are in a school and you get their password and you promise not to read their email and weird stuff like that. If you search on PubMed, it comes back with the most recent science first. So PubMed has defaulted to new science must be the best. And in this case, actually the first paper is one from my classmates at Scripps, and it's really fascinating because they showed a tremendous recovery of fish stocks in a very short time by just protecting them and leaving them alone and having the public engaged in protecting those resources. So in this case, PubMed actually does a good job of bringing a pretty great piece of science up first, but it's because it was the most recent thing. It doesn't actually have anything to do with what the science says. Then there's the case that sometimes you search for literature and you get something that has a tremendous number of scientific citations. So that's a way that scientists ostensibly rank each other's quality, but it's a really weird metric to use to try to talk about quality of publications. It's basically the way that we salute each other in the literature, but it takes a while for that to happen because your paper has to be seen and then cited, and then that paper needs to make it through peer review. So it takes a while before you'll even have a sense of how many citations you're going to get. And it ends up being almost, well, and a citation can mean a lot of different things too. It can mean this was amazing and it inspired me. It can mean this was crap and I'm about to refute it. It can mean here's some stuff I found, it's in my introduction and I can't wait to get on to the results. Or it can mean this was the first person who coined this phrase, and so now I have to give them credit for the phrase. So when you see a paper with 4,000 citations, what that means is that Joe Connell is very famous, and he wrote that paper a long time ago, and it inspired a lot of basic science. But it actually is more about tropical forest than it is about coral reefs, and it doesn't tell us anything about coral reefs now. So scientists' only real official metric of quality is not a very useful quality metric. And then sometimes you're searching for science and you get 1,000 hits back and you don't have any other way to navigate through past that. So if we look for coral reefs and we get 1,043 papers, then what? You can keep typing keywords in there, but what if you just want the best information on coral reefs? There's no other narrowing capability. It's just a list of journal article titles. And so we can take this to the almost absurd extreme, and I can show you that I don't even know which of my own pieces of science is the best. If I go to Google Scholar and put myself in, I get papers in the reverse order that I wrote them, because the older papers have more citations than the newer ones. So as a young scientist, time is not really an informative metric of whether one piece of literature was better or not, but that's the only way we have to sort it. And then if you go not too far down, you find somebody acknowledging me for scrubbing underwater cages and catching fish and drinking beer at Sharky's Pub in Key Largo, which is a highly rated pub on Yelp.com. So the only information we have now is where to drink in Key Largo, but not actually whether this was a more important contribution to science than the stuff that appears near it. So this is a silly version of a real problem. Scientists have a hard time even finding their way through their own literature, each other's literature, their own fields. And so imagine how hard it is for anybody else to dig through this stuff. So if I can't figure out which one of my own papers is the best, what about science writers who are trying to communicate this stuff to the public, and the policymakers and their aides that certainly don't have time to become experts in a field but want to use this information to make a difference? And then there's interns at NGOs who show up and they know nothing except they want to save the world. Where do they start? How do they find their way through? Then there's people who are looking for medical literature, doctors and therapists that want to make the best diagnoses and prescribe the best treatments. And they're actually buried in a lot of literature and locked out from a lot of it too. There's school teachers who would love to teach the most official, the most pure form of the facts that they can, and they can't get access to this. And there are science fair nerds who would love to dig through the scientific literature. And then everybody has some friend or family member who's got some decision-making power somewhere out in the world, and maybe they want to be able to use science to make good decisions. Marine park managers on little islands don't have very much money, and they're isolated from everyone else, and they would love to make better decisions based on what is a good way to conserve marine resources. And they actually have a tremendously difficult time getting into the literature and figuring out what it means. And then finally, Barack Obama. If he's going to make some good decisions about ocean ecosystems, it would be great if he could also dig into this literature and find, as quickly as I found Anchor Steam on Yelp.com, some good prescriptions for helping the ocean and the earth. So here are all these people who would love to get at basic science, get at the raw data, the literature in the scientist's word, or something very close to it, and almost none of them can find their way. So this isn't really just me complaining about the organization of scientific literature, because scientists seem to be doing well enough on their own. I'm starting to worry that this sort of problem is becoming more and more dangerous for us as a society. So what used to be just the quirks of old-time academia, we did our thing hidden in the ivory tower and we chattered amongst ourselves and we didn't bother talking to the common folk. It's now starting to be a threat because we're running out of time to make good decisions and to get information into the right people's hands. And this is happening at many different levels. So the dangers of being disorganized when it comes to science. First of all, I showed you how scientists are pretty swamped by even their own field of expertise. We have a hard time jumping out of exactly what we know very well and finding the right good literature. If I want to sort of branch into terrestrial ecology, or a certain quirk of terrestrial ecology, it takes me hours to figure out who wrote the best piece, what's most authoritative. Then if you make this literature hard to navigate, it makes it easy for people to just come in and cast doubt where there should be none. So there's actually sort of a whole industry of people who like to just glaze good scientific information with a layer of doubt in order to stall decisions from being made. This actually happened with the link between smoking and lung cancer, quite famously. And there's a great book about it called Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, in which they describe exactly how these people went about adding doubt to science where there deserved to be none. That's pretty dangerous. Then, because we have a hard time telling what is the best science, it's easier to make fake controversies within science, and journalists love to talk about human drama, so that's what they end up focusing on when they talk about science. So where you might have a large scientific consensus and one dissenter, a journalist will see that as controversy and report both sides of it equally with equal weight. I actually remember reading the New York Times article about the Large Hadron Collider, and I had no idea at the end if I should be worried about black holes, because that concern was presented with equal weight to the physicist who said this is going to be fine. And I got really mad, thinking, like, well, great, now this could happen to me on my way to work too. So scientists who have a consensus should not be undermined by this sort of single person who wants to create a scene, who has an agenda. There's always the case of the one scientist who was right when everyone else was wrong. I mean, Einstein was right, but we can't let Einstein as an example rule our way of thinking to a point where we ignore scientific consensus when it's important and it's there. What happens when all of this squabbling is going on is that the public just tunes out, because we report different things every week in the literature. This happens a lot with health research. Does it help your cholesterol? Does it not? Is it good to stretch before running? Is it not? And people just tune out. They can't figure out what we're talking about, and it just looks like a little steady stream of random bits of information. So that's not useful to the public. And then if you're a decision maker who needs to make difficult decisions that are going to cost a lot of money and piss a lot of people off, it's way easier not to make those decisions when you can't get access to the raw information driving those decisions, and neither can your constituents. So in the case of ocean policy and conservation, we're just kicking cans down the road because nobody's really able to show why we should stop and make a tough decision. This is getting depressing. People's faces are sinking, but I promise I'll make it funnier in a second. The conclusion to all of this is that we're wasting time. We're starting conversations over again. We're squabbling about stupid little stuff. We're talking amongst ourselves when we should be talking at the public, at policymakers. So we're wasting time. And this is a weird irony of the whole situation. It's the information age, and yet scientific information, the kind of information that we in theory think is the most valuable, has somehow not kept up with the tools of the information age. That to me is so weird. I keep having to stop and think, is this really true? Is this really a problem? But almost everyone I talk to about this in academia sort of has their own version of this frustration that they want to express. So I think that the information age could better serve scientific information. So that brings us to this information age. Everything that we are surrounded by nowadays comes along with phrases like these. Almost everything we do involves user rankings, culling preferences from your search patterns and from your tastes. Makeup Alley, would you repurchase this item? There's a button next to almost everything in our world where you can click it and say how you feel about it. And so this is the information age, and as I said before, it's the age of Google. It's also the age of the remix. I actually think that was like 2005 hip-hop, but scientists work in long, awkward blocks of time like that, so 2005 wasn't that long ago. So why not do all of these things with scientific information? That might sound absurd, but I'm going to present a way that we could maybe make it work. And I apologize for my cutting and pasting is the only skill I have besides being a scientist. So what if we gave scientists a way to rank the literature right in their faces as they're using it in their daily scientific lives? Science is it's objectively created information, but it can still be better or worse. It can be better executed, it can be better funded, it can be more thorough, it can be based on a false assumption, it can be wrong. So scientists can rank this stuff, and it doesn't take that many user ratings to come up with a consensus that tends to be a pretty accurate reflection of whether something is good or not. And you could give this to scientists right alongside the stuff that they're already using, like citation data, citation organizing software, and PDF accumulating software, and dishwashers, because scientists are too busy to wash their own dishes. Why not do this for scientists? Just put this in their faces and let them rank it. And then that is how you can at least allow scientists to find their way through this stuff. One of the things that my PhD advisor would really love to see is this little piece at the top here. We have recommendations for you. Again, it's easier to shop on Amazon than it is to shop for science, but what if this sort of platform took what you're interested in science and found things distantly related that fit in some way because of some underlying theory or some basic essence of that piece of literature. Instead of some ecologist tromping through the theoretical literature in physics, you could tell them exactly which things might fit in with what they already know. You could spur a lot of cross-cutting interdisciplinary research by exposing scientists to the best stuff in each other's fields, if we knew what it was. You could even do this inside the peer review system if you really wanted to. Scientists already rank each other's quality. We just do it in these hidden parts of peer review under the anonymous curtain of peer review. But you could have a process in which you said, this is really important for policy, this is the best one that they've done so far, this is crap. And embed that with the literature. So there's no reason we couldn't do this for scientific information. It's just that scientists themselves have never really asked for these tools because they have failed to realize that this is the way that we need to organize it. They're still sort of wondering why this public isn't listening, but they don't understand that there's no way to listen. So at the same time, why don't we give other people as much access as they can to this stuff along with a bunch of tools to understand it? Yet the cutting and pasting continues. So what if we put scientific literature right alongside photographs and the raw data and information about who the authors are so you can figure out whether they're experts or not? What if we add the media coverage and the blog posts and the radio interviews? Right now we have these things in two different parts of the internet, and so if you want to learn about science, you sometimes can't even figure out from a piece of news coverage which article they're talking about. Why not put those in the same place? And you can dig in as deeply as you want, or stay as shallow as you want, but the whole story is presented. What is the other thing that I wanted to say here? Oh, and you could put raw data in there. You can put a lot of data and let people see for themselves. I mean, particularly photographs like Lauren's is a tremendously appealing form of raw data, but put the photographs of the bottom of the ocean, put the graphs, put a big heap of data, let people sort through it themselves. A friend of mine wants to have like a virtual Google of the ocean floor. He just wants to be able to swim around in the ocean, see all of the corals, and then see them change through time. So if you had a picture of the ocean from 5 different reefs, and you're trying to make the argument like this protection is working better than this protection, put a picture of the ocean floor and put a picture of the water column, and let people see for themselves. More and more science is based on photographs and visual information as we get better ways of doing imaging and gathering visual data, so that makes the perfect sort of material to just give people to see for themselves. And then, of course, you need a way to plus one it. I don't even know if that's the verb, plus one it. You guys have to tell me that. You need a way to plus it. add it, I don't know. So here's something a little bit more controversial. What if you put the policy implications right alongside of the literature? We tend to wait a long time for pieces of science to be summarized into consensus documents. Like this one here is from the National Academy of Sciences, talking about how fishing has changed ecosystems. If we know what's wrong and what to do about it, I don't see why we shouldn't put those things near each other. It used to be very uncool for scientists to step out into the world and say what might be done. But I think scientists of my generation are much more comfortable with saying, I can do objective science and I can make a recommendation about what should be done. To me, that's as easy as I can accurately read a thermometer and I can also make a slightly biased recommendation about whether the air conditioner should be turned on. But if I can explain my reasoning, there's no reason that you should expect that that has influenced my ability to read a thermometer. And then finally, I would really love to know which sunscreen is #1 among Caribbean coral biologists. So you could add all sorts of money-related features into a platform like this. You could sell me sunscreen and I would probably buy a lot of it if I knew it was the right one. This is a little bit campy, but the idea is sort of important because so much science is locked behind a subscription wall. If you could pay to get it into the public arena in many different ways, more people could get at it. And if you could pay for it by me clicking on sunscreen ads, all the better. You could also imagine ways of giving funding agencies credit or declaring what the restrictions of the funding agencies were. You could sort of award funding agencies who made that research publicly available, give them little props out in internet space. You could even link in ways to fundraise more. So you could say, this was supported by National Geographic, and if you want to give them more money, here's how to do it. Linking the people who want to get at this information to the information itself could happen in a lot of different ways. And you'd also have to find some sort of user interface designer because this is not going to really work so well. There's so much plagiarism on this page, but I hopefully, sorry, internet. It's fair use. It's a remix. There's no one piece that I've plagiarized too heavily. Okay, so is this totally naive? Is this something just excessively optimistic that I want because I'm a child of the internet age and I want everything to be easy and clickable? Well, I think that there's some sign that this might not be completely absurd. And that's because I stole one of those squares from alongside the Scientific Journal of the Public Library of Science, or PLOS. So there they are. There are the star rankings right alongside an article from my PhD advisor and Professor Jeremy Jackson and quite a number of my classmates. So the weird thing about these star ratings is that nobody seems to ever use them on PLOS, which is interesting. I think it's because it's not anonymous and because no scientists realize the value of doing something like this yet. So it feels sort of like, wait, what? Do you want me to click some stars? But the fact that it's here right alongside a scientific journal is at least a signal that this is an okay thing to do to science. And I should stop and actually acknowledge what Public Library of Science is doing for scientific communication, because they're making a lot of different tools that are helping push the raw science and an interpretation of that science out into the public arena. So they make all of their articles open access. They have a space for comments. They have a journal club where different experts get together and talk about different pieces of literature. They even have public summaries that they ask their authors to write. Write 200 words, and that's going to come alongside your primary literature so that more people will be able to understand what it means. So they're doing a really great job. It's just that every other scientific journal in the world is not doing this. and doesn't even really have a sense that this is where we should be going. So to tie all of these random topics together in 1 or 2 sentences, fishing and a lot of other human activities have been wrecking the ocean, and nobody's paying attention to scientists when they talk about it in the news. But that's because science is not the news. Science is a product, and it's meant to be sorted and ranked the same way that we sort other useful things like beer and makeup. But instead, we're leaving science sort of hidden in dusty corners of the internet, in the most boring places in the internet, where nobody really wants to go. What we should be doing instead is using the power of the information age to put this information out where people can get access to it, so that we can start fixing things like overfishing, keep this earth working for everyone who's coming down the line after us. So one last thought about the ocean, and then we'll hash it out. It used to be that humans could be scale bars in pictures of marine organisms. And I actually was lucky enough to get to be a scale bar of my own not too long ago. This is one of the corals I study, and I think even that is hard to get a sense of. This coral is bigger than me with fins. It's the size of a VW bug, and it's 500 years old. And I realized when I found this photograph that what I was doing was setting myself up to be the before picture in a really depressing pair of photographs 50 years from now. So what is the photograph going to be that comes after this one? That's what worries me, and that's why I care about this issue. And that's why scientists are struggling to try to communicate what they know to the public, but having a hard time doing it. So when we're thinking about boring and weird and vague things like data organization, what we're asking is, what's going to be after this photograph? What's the picture in 2060? So with that, I would like to thank you guys for your attention and the various people who helped move these ideas around and make them more public. And I'd be happy to answer questions now or at lunch or by your favorite form of communication, +1s, phone, underwater hand signs, whatever it might be. So thanks very much. Oh, I think Adam's going to be my question host, actually. We're gonna do the microphone so that everybody else can hear him.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk, and I love the
Thanks.
sentiment. I completely agree with you. I'm going to question a particular assumption you've made, which is that more data, more transparency, more availability of data is necessarily a good thing. I want to believe that in my heart of hearts. Here's the problem, is that if, for example, you go to Maine and look at the lobster catch over the past 20 years, it has been going up and up and up and up. Is that a good thing? The data would suggest so,
Right,
and the
right.
lobstermen think it's so, but there's good reason to believe that the fishery is actually being mismanaged.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem with a lot of data is that it requires some kind of interpretation, and that's what sites like Many Eyes and other sites like Fusion Tables allows people to do, is to actually take data, apply some measures to it. And so, for example, looking at the average history of temperatures in Houston, Texas, for the past couple of months has been, is that a signal plus or a signal minus? And
Right.
so what I'm trying to understand is how can we frame these large data sets in ways that are helpful rather than more obscurationist?
Right, that's a good question. So is just showing everybody the raw data going to help, or are we just going to have different squabbling arguments about different parts of the data? The lobster issue is actually really interesting. Since we ate all the cod, no fish are eating the lobsters, and so now we have this huge lobster catch, which we shouldn't have because we should have cod. So people love to use examples like that to stall decision making. I think you can start to worry about, like, oh, what about this data set that's going to give people the wrong conclusion? It seems like what we need is for the whole conversation to be more open and more honest, so that somebody says, well, lobster catches are going up, and then there's 10 other papers that show, well, that's because we ate all the cod. So if we have these conversations alongside the data and we have them in a more transparent way. I'd like to think that cherry picking of data, as we like to call it, doesn't gain any sort of traction. It's not easier to tell the wrong story because we've put more data out there. But it's certainly an issue. The PLOS system actually has a set of moderators where if people are just being really hysterical and ridiculous, they say, okay, you're not acting the way scientists and academics should act. I guess what you're bringing up at point is that humans are still humans, so we're still going to have our different incentives and interests, and we have to keep that in mind. That's a good question, and it's a good thing to think about.
I was thinking about the +1 system. It may result in somewhat unexpected consequences if it is implemented. For one, some people would think very high of themselves. They would want to +100 it instead of +1, and they would want to discount others. So they would definitely demand some ranking based on the whatever achievements. And if they do not get it, they probably would not participate. Another consideration about it is along which axis, along nice pictures. Sure, a lot of public will say that is really great. Mm-hmm. And then what is the scientific value of the text in this article? That's another axis. And then even presence of this rating would somehow steer the science from doing something that is scientifically worthy into something that looks catchy. So what are you thinking about it?
Those are great points, and there are things that you have to consider when you try to. What you're hitting on is that beer is easier to shop for than science. It's just true. It's a lot easier to make a subjective rating about a glass of beer. It's certainly true that we would be giving scientists sort of a new incentive to chase after things that get high ratings, but I think that that's okay. I think scientists need to be brave enough to say, like, okay, it didn't get that highly rated, but that's because it was about something that was not policy relevant, or that's because I didn't try that hard, or that's because it was the third version of that I had published. So in a sense, I think scientists need to sort of swallow their pride and say, like, okay, let's really see what's better than not. And there's lots of different ways that there's lots of different axes that you could rate along. You could just say that we just want something to be like, this is urgent for policy making, or you could make an axis that's reliability, thoroughness. I think on PLOS there's 3 different stars that you can fill out and they kind of average them all. You could have it be much more lengthy than that. I guess on Wikipedia they have 4 different ratings: thorough, accurate, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess that's for us to figure out next, right? What is the best way to rate this stuff? But I don't think that the complications and the potential side effects are going to be severe enough that we should avoid it altogether. We should figure out a way to make it work. Good question.
So unfortunately, the Tech Talk team's scheduled 2 back-to-back, so we can take maybe 1 or 2 more questions live, but then Kristen and I will be having lunch somewhere, so feel free to join us for lunch. And I think Anurag will be joining us as well. So, oh boy, this is so hard. There's so many. Okay, I'll pick.
I'll try to do quicker answers.
How big of a problem do you think the restricted access to journal articles is? I mean, are we on the right track with that with PLOS, or is that a big limiting factor too?
Right. How big of a problem? It's a huge problem. My little sister just finished physical therapy school, and then her academic subscription ticked off, and now she can't see the best physical therapy literature. It's a problem in so many different professions. Google Scholar is amazing because it just finds PDFs from I don't know where and brings them up to the surface, and I love it for that. And I know that helps a lot of people in the middle of nowhere do their conservation jobs. And PLOS is on the right track by putting everything open access. But that means that the scientists themselves have to pay $3,000 an article for all of the costs of publication. So then if you're a poor scientist or you ran out of funding, you have to figure out how to deal with the financial limitations. So we could definitely find better ways to fund it so that everything was open access. I think that's the goal.
I'm going to take one last question.
Okay.
Sorry.
So when you're an academic and you're starting your first job and you want to get that tenure track position, one of these things you need to do is to publish, and it's not just publish in general. You want to hit a couple of key publications. Today, those publications generally insist on being the first to publish and that you don't, open access your stuff. What do you see the barriers of being to, let's say, a new person trying to establish themselves in the field to, let's say, convince their university that what they ought to do is make the new criteria for publication to be this internet channel as opposed to, let's say, the old school?
I actually talked to Professor Jackson before I gave this talk. So the question is, how do we make this the standard, the norm, this idea that ranking is somehow the way we define quality. I told Professor Jackson I was giving this talk, and he said, people love rankings. I think academic committees would love another way to sort through the quality of their scientists. And it might just be that we need a little bit of time for the newest generation of scientists to get their footholds, because I think everyone in my generation is okay with that kind of thing. It's just the old guard might be a little bit more resistant. The one thing that scientists are kind of starting to do along those lines is use the H index, which is where you take the number of papers with the number of citations they each have, and you have to have H papers with H citations. So that's kind of a measure of bulk and quality of your research, but again, corrupted by the what does a citation mean issue and the aspect of time. But there's signs that we are looking for new ways to measure each other's quality, so it wouldn't be completely absurd to introduce a new one. Good question.
Okay, thanks again, Kristen, for coming and challenging us with some of these ideas. I think they're really important. So anyone who'd like to join us for lunch, just come find us over here. Thank you.
Thank you guys again.